The UTA School of Architecture presents Next, its 2021 to 22 lecture series. These lectures explore what's next from perspectives that include issues relating to the pandemic, navigation and shifts in our social culture, and transformations in response to climate change. Discussions and work represent thoughtful and creative production that challenges the discipline. Next advocates for new and progressive approaches that expand upon normative practice and underscore a commitment of scholarship and inquiry from the School of Architecture.
Let me start with this. This is sort of a soundbite from Hal Foster. Spielraum was a monograph of our work we did a few years ago. And Hal was really talking about this idea of bricolage as a kind of way of working. So I think, as Charles was saying, I mean, there's this idea of sourcing and searching in our work in terms of fabrication. I would characterize our practice as a material one, meaning architectural ideas, form making, spatializing really comes from the handling of a material. And the tooling of a material, whether it's with digital tools or analog tools. So this has really been kind of at the center of the practice for quite a while and overlaps with our teaching. For example, with Cornell right now, we're teaching the vertical factory, a studio on occupying structure, the idea of structural depth as a kind of spatial or programmatic condition. Revolutions, a choice is really about this idea. We did an exhibition last fall here in Berlin, which is kind of the perfect COVID exhibition. We collected all of our work in this warehouse in East Berlin and then moved it across town where we exhibited in the house Walsee, this villa in the background, which was the original Museum of Modern Art, post-World War II Museum of Modern Art in Berlin. Where we could do a kind of retrospective around our work. We didn't do it in a chronological way, but more in a kind of organized around our work areas, different work areas, and different sort of installation scale to study models. So, for example, this was a sculpture or kind of pavilion we did in the park there. This was a project we had done for the Serpentine Galleries in London. In Kensington Gardens. We moved it back to Berlin. We reclad it in metal for a 3-year sort of duration of the exhibition here. So pavilions, we produced a new piece, these 2 walls, physical casting in Infilite concrete, which is a self-insulated concrete. We cast this nearby. So we had this huge advantage of sort of doing everything locally during COVID, so we could move things across town. We could produce things in town or in our studios and then move them into the exhibition space. The exhibition was indoors, outdoors, so it worked during the pandemic as a kind of collective. So our work material was brought in here, installations that we had shown elsewhere into the space. And as Charles and I were talking about earlier, you know, like really showing the work physically, the models that we build, one-to-one installations in the space to show how we work, but really with an emphasis on processes. So, and in the exhibition, the work was organized around these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 work areas. Academic wasn't part of that. That's I'll show a couple projects we're doing in Texas right now down at Rice that as a kind of add-on, but these are really the kind of work and research areas in the last 5-10 years that we've really been looking at. So in a way, topographical really talks about for me, you know, I'm from Montana. I grew up in the American West, you know, so landscape, land art was really important for me as a kind of architectural reference. So when we came to Berlin, after the Berlin Wall came down, we were not working in the center of the city. We were working out in the peripheries, out, you know, in the outskirts. And one of the projects that we did, which was a competition that we One was the so-called biosphere in Potsdam, Germany. This was a militarized site. The berms that you look at here were built by the Soviets to protect their barracks. These were appropriated by a landscape architect as a kind of public reclamation project for public parks. We were interested in the idea of land art at the time. Regina and I were teaching at the AA in London. We became familiar with Claude Perrint's work, this idea of oblique surfaces or a kind of experiential moving up and down sloped surfaces as a kind of architectural idea. The project we did was the idea of these berms and different materials, framing, kind of huge interior space in section that could excavate, a kind of cut and fill operation to lower the building as a biosphere, a kind of large garden exhibition space for the German garden show. This is a shot during construction. So all of a sudden also, this is kind of an early project in our practice, but all of a sudden we're doing these large kind of infrastructure scaled projects and prefabricated concrete, using landscape as a kind of architectural material, the idea of architecture as landscape or vice versa. So, I mean, these were pretty exciting projects for us to start. And at the same time, that was or were paralleling some of the ideas, our teaching ideas, the idea of these damaged sites or landscapes in a place like Berlin, which is very flat. So any kind of topography is usually artificial. So this dialogue between Peter Latz's landscapes and the building itself, which, as I was saying, is built out of a kind of landscape as a material. On the south side, this idea of excavating to create the interior spaces within it to produce a kind of garden show, which later became a kind of exhibition space as it is today. So a very simple building, in a way, brutalist kind of construction, or very primitive, very low tech in constructing this. The whole building had to be built within 12 months. This was, in a way, a kind of great project for us to cut our teeth. Jumping forward to a project I did with the actor Christoph Waltz, was directing Fidelio Beethoven's only opera in Vienna in the Theatron de Wien. This is where Beethoven originally performed this opera. Christoph asked me to come in to do sets for it. Again, thinking topographical was to produce sets for the opera that for us were three-dimensional. So we began drawing it. Christoph would come over to our studios. We could sit down together and sketch this thing. We produced models as a kind of double helix structure where the singers could move up and down. Also the idea of the sets as a kind of acoustical projector. Honeck directed the music. So it had a kind of both a kind of physical spatial aspect or character to it, as well as a kind of acoustical one in terms of projecting the movie music into the audience. We had to figure out how to build this thing. We prefabricated the structure in Poland, in timber construction, in segments. We later brought it to Vienna and built it almost like a ship in a bottle through the back doors, these very small doors, brought it in. But we're very keen on the idea of a kind of spatial expansion of the historical space of the theater, the seating, which in itself is already topographical. So there was this kind of continuum or kind of dialogue between those two spaces where the singers could move up and down and through this space, as well as in sort of direct dialogue with the audience in the historical spaces beyond it. We got shut down 2 weeks before the opening with COVID, so we were never actually able to open this to the public. But we were lucky to film this. So if you go to YouTube, you can watch this thing, and it's 2.5 hour entirety if you don't have something you do on a Sunday afternoon. So again, this kind of dialogue between a historical space, and again, this idea of the kind of interior as a kind of monumental interior, where the singers, either singular or in mass, could move up and down and through this thing. So even though it was filmed frontally, the spaces is extremely three-dimensional and use the entire depth of the kind of backstage for doing this. At another scale, we just started construction for Estrel Tower in Berlin. This will be the tallest high-rise in Berlin, 45 stories or so, hotel, offices, ballrooms. I always thought of this thing as topographical in the sense of, we started with this game Tangram, which is kind of a children's game of triangulation, parallelograms, and then sort of think about that as an extruded system that could produce the volumes for the high rise, mid rise, low rises as a topographical operation. And high rises in Berlin don't usually occur as you would find in New York or maybe Houston or Los Angeles. I mean, they're usually isolated and exist in these kind of ensembles or islands outside of town in the periphery. This is very close to the new airport, which is finally open. So will act as a kind of gateway to the city, as a kind of landmark building. Topographical also in the sense of form making. These are process models for the ballroom area, which we did dozens and dozens of iterations of this, which then kind of key into this atrium space, which orients all the buildings together. So as a kind of topic, and I think, almost all these projects are in Berlin, but the idea of creating these artificial topographies as a kind of landscape, either horizontally or vertically. For example, this is an office building or as a work-live space in the Fürstenstraße on an oblique corner site. The high-rise is offices. The low-rises are either affordable housing or mid-income housing as a mixed use, but almost as an extruded idea of a stone, highly textured stone facades. The buildings are radially disposed around the site. The context is sort of post-war, modernist buildings in terms of orientation, but as a new typology. So we're kind of working also in Berlin between the periphery, so the outskirts of town, and then, after a while, we were sort of allowed to work, in the center, in the middle. So these projects, end up, again, I see them as topographical, but also urban. So the difference between a kind of almost rural or peripheral condition versus working urbanistically. Surface making facades was important for us, that they were performative facades, that they're sustainable, but looking at stone cutting, tradition of stone cutting in Germany, Europe, to produce highly textured surfaces for that facade. We have kind of our practice centers around a workshop here. We also have a little gallery space in the front. So a lot of these projects have to do with our, I think Charles was, alluding to that, very much hands-on, and casting is something I've been fascinated for a long time. So these are casting, for example, here, casting with infrared concrete. This is debris from some of the landscapes around town, which are fragments of building materials from buildings that were destroyed during World War II, gathering these as kind of materials as found into these, super beautiful cast pieces. They're not big. You guys could make these also in your shops. Sort of testing ideas for casting, or sand casting, rock casting, debris casting, in these sort of form works that we started to sketch up in these models. So we produced these models. This would be a gateway to the exhibition. So we were interested in it being spatial. So we ended up putting two of them facing off with each other in order to make that as a kind of debut or an introduction to our work. This is Jan Pablo from our office. These guys just went, again, we were doing all this local. They went, to Potsdam and started building these things, putting the aggregate in themselves, working with these guys, these Polish guys ended up installing these things, putting them in place. But, and maybe, one of the nice things about Germany is getting your hands on fabricators, on construction people that will help you produce systems which, again, don't exist in a building catalog, so that we find ourselves often fabricating or constructing or imagining building components. So even though this is for an exhibition, it's easy to imagine this becoming building components for future projects of geek work. This is one of our GSD students who's a potter. This is something I grew up next to the Archie Bray in Helena, Montana, where before I learned how to draw, I learned how to build pottery with my hands. Workshops in our practice where we use coil systems. And again, a lot of these things can interpret to digital technologies of casting or pouring. A woman from California who could double wall cast. And these things are scalable also. So for me, these things exist one-to-one. They could also exist and translate into a building scale. The way they specialize, as these sort of been indicated with these little figures here, the cantilever project on the right, we produce these as kind of formal studies, but they're open to interpretation, as well as cladding systems. For example, these extruded pieces are now being produced and installed in a 300 meter long loft building that we're doing in Berlin, which a local fabricator in Frankfurt put these into production. So again, the sort of experimental work often leads to applications into building projects such as this one. So this is a 300 meter long loft building, entirely clad in a terracotta glazed tile, which in Texas you would have access also, I would imagine, in Texas or to the south in Mexico. Bundles is another strategy. I think Charles was also alluding to this through discovery. I found in Munich students using scripting technologies, software, and then finding a laser cutting fabricator in Munich who could script and cut these tubes tangentially to each other to create these arrays, which are there in top right. This is also a time when we stopped doing exhibitions with models and drawings. We started almost exclusively doing exhibition in one-to-one. So almost like a Merzbau space. It's spatial, experiential, it has a certain scale. This became much, much more appetizing to us in terms of showing our work in exhibition venues. Thicket, for example, same kind of thing. This is appropriating a coat hanger technology, digitally bent and then bundled together tessellated structures with zip ties. This was an installation at first in Berlin, which then traveled to Princeton, where we turned it into a pavilion with a roof and floor. Used this kind of almost Conrad Wachsmann-like drawing for understanding the geometry. Self-teaching, we sort of self-teach ourselves. The coat hanger company made these elements for us, and then we bound them or bundled them together in our courtyard at our studios. Tried to weld them to too complicated. Trial and error is also an aspect of this kind of experimentation, and end up bundling them very quickly. This was a proposal for the Serpentine Galleries as an array or a kind of architectural scale, turning this structural system into a kind of pavilion, village almost. But the idea of vertical structure being something not physical and very heavy, but as being something very ephemeral, almost like a blur structure. They were 2 millimeter, very thin, but extremely strong. They could hold a roof up. That could produce these kinds of environments or spaces. Again, that was for Princeton. These architectural biennales we like to use as places to test ideas. This was for Mark Lee, Sharon Johnson's Chicago Architectural Biennale a few years ago, where we made 3 material propositions for affordable housing for point towers for Berlin in metal, in timber, and in infralight concrete, which is the one on the right. So we started looking at material arrays, again, taking timber, there's pine all around Berlin, which is easily harvested, not as a kind of substitute column, but timber as kind of clearings or arrays, which have a structural logic. These things could be built very quickly, very economically, and as our legislation for timber construction become closer and closer for high-rise structure, timber construction in Berlin, as Europe is radically shifting, as probably the States too, to mass timber construction. So these are proposals for housing here, talking to the Berlin Senate, the building department here, in terms of finding ways for producing these kinds of buildings. This one with the guy drinking beer, we're looking to construct this for social housing in the Karl Marx Allee in Berlin. This is prefabricated infralight concrete. We made these highly three-dimensional, like a house of cards. They're structural. They also sort of riff off the idea of the Plattenbau, or the East German, communist era concrete precast housing, social housing. So we also like, kind of the relationship between history and some of these things. And then the thicket structure was probably a less feasible idea for bundles, for structural bundles for this particular array. Frames refer to another sort of structural typology, frames as in Varandeel frames, space frames, structural frames, which determine the architectural outcome. And I think pavilions have been a kind of typology that's somewhere in between an experiment and an actual programmed permanent building as a kind of experimental type, which we like a lot. This is a kind of pavilion along a bike and hike way in this valley up out of Stuttgart. We were fascinated by Conrad Waxman's work in space frame production in the 50s. Buckminster Fuller also is involved in this. Conrad Waxman's grapevine structure on the right, this quite famous sketch that he did where the structure is woven together. We're also building in a vineyard. The idea of the structure having a kind of depth that could be occupied to produce this pavilion. So we produced it as a kind of folly or as a one-off, but obviously these kinds of structures can expand. They could translate into other materials that could be used for industry, for exhibition, and sort of self-teaching ourselves, different ways of attaching these things, weaving these structures together with the same engineer that Charles was talking about for our gatehouse, Werner Sobeck. So in Germany, the engineers are really the rock stars. So these kinds of collaborations are a lot of fun to do. So again, this is kind of the idea of the steel tubing being a kind of continuous structure to weave a pavilion like this together. We translated this actually a bit earlier. This is for Stihl's headquarters. Stihl makes chainsaws, these pretty awesome chainsaws, and the company is down South Germany. They also have a forest, so we could harvest the timber for the construction of their showrooms for their products, which again are mostly these chainsaws. So we could harvest the timber, produce these super very simple kind of low tech trusses, and then assemble them into a large roof structure to cover their showrooms for their customers for their products. So these are these logs, which again are just sort of bolted together at the joints in a very simple way to produce these kinds of spaces. So this is something that we like to do, is find companies in industry where whatever they make or whatever they do can be have a direct kind of participation into the construction of an architectural idea. So their headquarters on the left, this sort of mid-rise building, is from the 50s, and our proposal was for this structure for the exhibition spaces of their factory. Harvard Art Lab is a kind of project we did more recently and just completed. Art Lab was for overflow space in the Alston campus, which is across the Charles River from the historical Harvard core. This is a net zero building, which was important for Harvard. It's a building that's temporary in the sense that we can disassemble this building and move it somewhere else on the campus, as Harvard has a lot of space on that campus. We modeled it, also the idea of frame. I mean, this is a very simple construction in the end. We looked at timber. Was difficult to do in Cambridge. So we ended up doing steel frame, open web joist structure in a kind of pinwheel configuration around a central hub space that could expand into exterior workspaces. The building's clad in polycarbonate from Italy, which is a very highly insulated material combined with clear glazing as a kind of almost like a kit of parts. As said, it's net zero. It produces all of its energy from the photovoltaic on the roof. But for us, it was also kind of a new type for an academic building, which is flexible, can be used. We began our practice doing factories, lots and lots of factories. So the idea of a inexpensive industrial space for overflow, for the arts, for dance, for theater, for filmmaking, for fine arts, for exhibition, for producing, for maker spaces was a kind of interesting type for us. So that in a way, instead of doing these kind of bricks and ivy building that historically characterized Harvard, for us, this kind of building spoke more, for the arts and how the arts are conceived and, taught and performed. Today is, in a way, much more contemporary idea of how that might happen. And again, overlaps, I think, in terms of sensibility with buildings like this. Our smart factory in Chicago, which we did a couple of years ago, for us building in the States, meant building in steel, particularly in Chicago, with this kind of Miesian tradition, rust belt. We did a core 10 cladding and steel building here. The timber is a kind of charred timber cladding from Austin, Texas, from Delta, it's called. It's a great company. And a site which is also a kind of periphery site along the Interstate 90, not far from O'Hare International. We poached some I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we poached some land in this abandoned AT&T campus kind of office park campus to produce this building. The building is organized as a figure 8 around a courtyard here, office spaces, auditorium, and then a machine hall. Smart factory means 4.0 technologies from Germany. These are machine tools which build John Deere tractors. The machines are digitally connected, they're physically connected. So basically you flip a switch on and these machines run 24 hours a day. So there's an aspect of clients coming here to see how these machines work. So there's kind of transparency for the people who actually work here. This cafeteria, the timber from Texas on the left, and the Core 10 steel. But for us, in a way, and for me, being an American, I think it's also interesting to understand different building cultures. Like, how do you work in Chicago that's different than Switzerland, that's different than, say, working in Korea. And one of the things we wanted to do with this building was to use their technology, which is laser cutting. So we revisited Verandil presses, which you'll remember from your engineering classes were, designed back in 1898. Updated this digitally so that these are sort of digitally differentiated in terms of loading. We prefabricated these in Atlanta, put them on a truck, brought them up to the site, and then put them together to produce this long span space, but also the idea of occupying structure that one can walk through these trusses through this catwalk where clients can look below to see the machines producing parts for these tractors. So and for me, this is really exciting that you can still fabricate systems, obviously, in Europe, but also in America, where we could sort of mass custom structure like this in an industrial thing, and also in an affordable way to understand the economics of construction and to make this happen. So this is the production in Atlanta, the components being built there with the company Trumpf with F, which make machine tools, which can cut steel and weld steel digitally. So again, the factory as a factory showroom showing these technologies, at the same time the factory contributing to the components of the construction of their own building. So this kind of relationship has been an interesting one, and also the one I'll show in a second, the gatehouse in Stuttgart was produced again along those lines also. Liminal facade talks about facade making, facades, particularly in Germany, being performative, being where a lot of the sort of ambitions for sustainability, energy use happen. Seoul, Korea was a low E reflective glass facade. This was done, I think, 2006, 2007, where we really started looking at digital fabrication technologies to produce a facade, a custom facade. The glass came from Minnesota. The frames were built in Korea to produce a kind of kaleidoscopic effect in for us, a kind of non-context site, kind of emerging city, the so-called digital media city. These are 1 to 2 mock-ups in our courtyard here in Berlin. We did these mock-ups to understand really, really precisely how reflective glass works, which translated very precisely to the actual facade on the left. We got an engineer from ARUPS in Hong Kong to come in and do workshops with the local fabricators to produce this. But again, very exciting, where we started to produce, relatively complex facade systems and component systems for our buildings. Tour Total, shifting back to Berlin, looking at a facade not in glass, but about doing facades now that are not entirely made of glass, but are made of prefabricated concrete with sun protection within that, operable windows. that could produce a kind of visual effect using our skills, for digital fabrication to produce complex formwork for casting these. And I think we had like 250 different types of components that we could precast in extremely precise way in Frankfurt to produce facades now that are not like downtown Manhattan, the kind of or Houston maybe, glass facades, but facades with the kind of spatial depth that have to do with sun protection, have to do with climate and light, but at the same time produce a kind of formal and visual effect, such as the Bertha. This is on the other side of the sort of government center in Berlin, which we produced as a curtain wall, in a sense, a kind of contradiction, a glass curtain wall where these sort of staggered fins produce an effect. So in a way, it's a non-load bearing facade. So we kind of like these structural things, but in travertine, which is a local stone material in Berlin, has a long tradition, historical tradition going back to the 18th century. So, but using it in a completely new way, in a modern way, as a curtain wall, but again, one with a visual effect in terms of a dynamic, which is something we also did with this parking structure for electric cars in Germany for our machine tool company, again, using their technology to laser cut these fins to protect the spaces of this parking structure. So again, kind of a everyday, ordinary building type, but also one that we're interested in, building types like these, which can at a later date take more electrical cars, or even partially transform into workspaces or office spaces, or conceivably a different application for housing. So these kinds of projects, which are prefabricated and can be put together very quickly, to again asking questions. In this case, for a high-rise competition, we asked ourselves if we could do a curtain wall that was performative. Could we do glass and still do a good energy using building? I look back at my San Francisco days, the Halide building, which was the first curtain wall by Willis Polk as a glass curtain wall. We wanted to sort of see if we could update that into a modern version of that. We found with our engineers, we could do a doubled glass curtain wall with photovoltaic embedded into it, with operable windows that performed quite well, that still brought in an amazing amount of sort of daylight into office spaces, which also capture these kind of winter gardens for green spaces. So we lost this competition to David Chipperfield, but at the same time, the European competition system, it allowed us a kind of research project embedded into this in terms of producing a facade system, which we can use, on another day. So in a way, this project was valuable in the sense of using that to do that. So ultrastructural was really talking about a section on structure making. Here's a model I'm working on right now. So we're building models all the time. This is another project with Werner Sobeck. Concrete is bad, it's CO2 positive. Werner Sobeck wants to reduce the weight of concrete by 50%. So his idea in the beam, which is shown in the foreground, is to make concrete porous, like a bone. If you cut a section through your arm, you'll see bone structure that's like a sponge. So his idea is to, in a parametric way, through structural loading, to make it perforated. So in these examples show ideas about concrete to reduce weight, to reduce costs, speed. We produced this beam in our workshop downstairs. And based on Werner's loading diagrams, again, these are pretty cool. You could make them yourselves in your shops down there. And then we asked ourselves, well, if you had concrete that's super light, what would you do architecturally? So we produced a series of prototypes for suspended structures that could be suspended from a ceiling, in this case, modeling these things. If you remember a project like Louis Kahn's Kansas City high-rise, it was an idea of building a kind of superstructure where the floor plates could be hung from a kind of beam structure from the top. So we started sketching these up with this material in mind as, again, kind of prototypes, waiting for us to build someday. But this was our sort of architectural response to Werner's sort of promotion of a new idea in terms of handling concrete. This is the version of Kahn's slip casting example, historical example on the left, and some of our ideas of using these spaces for living, work, vertical gardens, farming, etc. So these are some of our response to what I guess I would call emerging technologies. This is kind of zooming back, also the idea of light thicket, looking at nature or natural systems of organization for producing structures. This is also around the time of Korea, where we're mass customizing in the Black Forest, timber cells for a structure. We're modeling it. The guy, Gunther, down on the right is drawing it with two hands going at the same time. This is all pre-cut in the Black Forest, brought up to Stuttgart, and then erected very quickly on site to produce this cantina, which is kind of a event space with natural daylight above, glulam. So this is probably the first building that we built where everything is entirely fabricated, a lot of it digitally fabricated, tiles, concrete, timber, and steel, including the facades that we could actually, in a way, mass customize an entire building based on sort of our research interests. So this is kind of a milestone for us in terms of this type of building. The idea of it as a kind of social center for this industrial campus, a place to meet. You can see that building in the background. This is the gatehouse that Charles was talking about as a kind of I don't know, in Germany you say Visitenkarte as a kind of entry point for the company using their technology, demonstrating their technology in a 20-meter cantilevered roof, which obviously has a huge counterweight underground in the back. We also produced a double entirely glass curtain wall. We appropriated their technologies for shipbuilding, for table building. This is laser cutting and laser welding, which is a similar technology. We took Werner Sobek, again, structural diagrams on the right, and then translated them into a kind of gradiated steel structure on the left, which is the roof, which makes legible the loading conditions for that structure, prefabricated it, brought it on site, connected all these pieces, lifted up with a crane, and then put the thing on the 4 columns. It was bouncing like a diving board, and then settled into place. But again, about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we really started producing and fabricating entire buildings through these kinds of systems. A curtain wall entirely made of glass, with plexiglass posts, plexiglass tubes sandwiched between 3 layers of glass with a kind of expansion joint at the top. In a way, this starts to become a kind of real estate project. The catenary infill is another structural idea of boxes which cantilever or catenary, sort of hang like a chain from party wall to party wall. It's an idea for empty sites in Berlin, Baulücken they're called, which are sites where buildings were destroyed during World War II. So in a way, this as a prototype is adaptable. It can get wider, it can get higher. It works as a kind of structural logic, but also work live. So the boxes in timber and steel are living spaces, whereas this column-free space in between can be a workspace. So, and it's adaptable. It can be higher, it can be lower, as a kind of idea for infill. So, and also a place where, as architects, we can start to operate as, in design build, we can, if we can acquire these sites, we could start to construct this kind of project. So where the structural engineering really is a spatial idea, it's a programmatic idea, and it's a real estate idea as well, in terms of doing that. Other projects, again, this relationship between the research and construction. This is a ruled geometry, a hyperbolic pavilion in Marrakesh next to the Ktabia Mosque, bringing sort of public arts to the public, to the exterior. There is no museum in Marrakesh. That project informed directly our Fellows Pavilion for the American Academy in Berlin, which is a steel structure, but the relationship between research and more permanent buildings, such as this one in the gardens of the American Academy in Berlin, which is a cellular structure where fellows can have a place to study and work for the semester that they are in Berlin working. So, so in a way, it's simply really just show the value of some of the more sketchy or experimental projects and how they might inform a more permanent project such as this one. I think I'm pretty much on time. I've got just two projects I wanted to show you in your home state there, and then we could open it up for questions. Academic is the work we're doing south of you in Houston for Rice. We're ended up doing two projects down there. That Rice University, and you've probably all seen it one time or another, but I was always fascinated with Rice, that campus, because it's sort of an incubator for architecture. It has the classical Beaux-Arts, Spanish colonial architecture of its origins. It had a really strong modernist era in the 50s and 60s, a postmodernist architecture. Sterling built there, Michael Graves, Caesar Pelli. To contemporary examples, there's a very beautiful pavilion there from Tom Pfeiffer. Michael Malzahn has done a museum there. So we ended up doing Sid Rich, which is a residential college. It's dormitories, but also common spaces next to the original Sid Rich Tower, which I think opened in the early 70s by LBJ, no less. This building ensemble really is about transitioning between Main Street, the diagonal of Main Street, which is high rises over there, to the scale of the campus and quad scale here. So in a way, the building is organized as 3 volumes, 12-story, 5-story, and a 2-story volume here, that mediate between that scale of Main Street to the scale of the quads here. This is a Salvetti Machado building over here that was done, I think, 15 years ago. This is the Grove, Oak Grove here, and the quad, which we share with this college over here, and a servery here. So that campus is characterized by brick, St. Joe brick from New Orleans. We went to New Orleans and we picked the mix for it. We also included terracotta, a brise soleil here, kind of topographical ground. Because of hurricanes, we have to lift the building up a couple meters. a terrace under the steel pergola for the building, a serrated facade. We played with the brick, and a lot of those lessons I think were learned in places like Hamburg, Germany, which has a strong tradition of ornamental brickwork. So we had highly textured brick. We changed the soldering, the texture and the direction of the brick. So there was a lot of capability in terms of really doing a building with virtuoso bricklayers there. So in a way, taking advantage of that in a place like Southern Texas to produce a building like this. This building we tried to do in timber, but because of the height of it, 12 stories, we were not allowed. So it's a concrete building with brick and brick infill with, in this case, kind of timber ceiling, acoustical ceiling for it, double height common space here, which is also a link to the servery of the building, this kind of pergola space for students to work in. So, I mean, as a kind of campus, dormitory space, all these, if you know, Rice, all these colleges have very strong identities. You know, on Friday afternoons, they blast AC/DC from the rooftop. So it was important for them that it was integrated into the campus, but that it would have its own identity and its own spaces within that campus. So that is the first building we've completed. We've just started construction for Hanson, which will be the second building we'll be doing, which now will be a mass timber building. It will be the first one on campus. This is basically a residential wing, which is kind of addition to the existing Hanson. This is the new wing we're adding onto. This is Machado. The Weiss quad is the Machado Silvetti building, and this building here, the Sid Rich over here. So, so we were lucky to get these two buildings. Formally, it's about kind of splitting the volume both in section and in plan in order to fit the programming. I can't remember, we have 180 rooms in this building, but prefabricating it in Arkansas, bringing in mass timber to the site, both to produce sustainable buildings, zero CO2, speed up construction costs and costs for this building wing, which then again is clad in a textured stucco and then also partially St. Joe brick on this building. So the section on the right works, so shows you the logic of the mass timber, the CLT cross-laminated timber decks for it. And the massing of the building on the left, and particularly in response to Jorge Silvetti's building that was done again some years ago, but meeting between that, again, a kind of late, in a way, a kind of late postmodernist building to the kind of neoclassical building from the early 20th century at the bottom, framing the quad. So and this kind of marks, you know, I think a shift in our work to mass timber, both here in Germany as well as into the States, for these kinds of economical buildings with very different budgets than that happened in Rice in the 20s. To this house I just did for myself up the road in Bozeman, Montana. Bozeman has been kind of a destination place through COVID. A lot of people moving here, startups. This is a space which is a residence for myself, but I can also use it as a live work. I have a studio space here, so people from MSU can work there, students can work there. We can use it as a kind of outpost, I suppose, from the Berlin office in Bozeman. It's an atrium house, which is kind of an unusual house typology for the north, maybe more common to the southwest. But for me, it was the house could be both extroverted and introverted. The courtyard is very private. The neighborhood will probably become, I characterize as kind of rural, suburban, will become more dense over time. There is a strong modernist tradition in Bozeman. Neutra did a house there in the 50s. It's organized as bedrooms and living spaces around this courtyard, which is a gravel courtyard with aspen trees. The angle in the lower corner is a studio space, which I can use for working. We're Zoom conferencing. So through the pandemic, in the construction of this project, it's become in a way more viable in terms of a place to live, but also a place to work off-site. It sits on 5 acres, so there's spaces to, and Charles and I were talking about this earlier, about producing and prototyping mock-ups outside of it. This is kind of a folded out section. The building is topographical in the sense that it steps down the slope of the site, allowing rooms to get bigger and bigger as they slope down under this flat roof. The building, the house is either prefabricated in glulam construction or balloon frame on site. So it's entirely produced in timber, which is common to the area. Before I went to architecture school, I worked as a carpenter. So my brother ended up building this house, has a construction company. So this house for me in a way is full circle. I mean, this is really where I started as an architect and I sort of returned as an architect in terms of doing a house project, which is very close to my heart. So this is a glulam construction. The chandelier we produced, we fabricated that here in Berlin. The floor is polished concrete, which is also the heating source, and the garden is kind of rainbow rock, gradiated rainbow rock, gravel. And this is the house at night, and I can't see where the horses are, but they're around there somewhere. So I'll finish with that slide, and I'll thank you for having patience and taking a look at that, but I'll conclude with that image.